Soldier Mage King, Chapter 1. The Last Dragonlord. To say that Balinor was surprised when a girl of maybe 19 walked into his cave would have been a bit of an understatement. In the dark of the cavern, it had been difficult to see the figure clearly until he caught her around her waist and pressed a knife to her throat. "What are you doing here?" "My friend, he's dying. He needs help. Please." She'd begged, and something in her face softened him. Somehow, she reminded him of Huneth years ago, though this girl's face was nearly fey in the angles of her cheekbones and the glint in her eye. Her friend bore the barest scratches from a dragon's claws, which could be deadly if not treated properly. She watched him like the hawk she was named for as he worked to heal Arthur. If he was honest, he was more than a little angry when they asked him to come to Camelot. He did note a difference, though. Arthur, Uther's son, asked him to kill Kilgara, while Merlin simply asked him to stop the dragon from killing anyone else. Her argument was much more convincing than his. Arthur made promises of reward, while Merlin spoke of Gaius and the people dying at Kilgara's claws who had never harmed another. That, more than anything, was what made Balinor follow them. Then he learned the truth. She was his daughter. It made sense why Gaius had sent her then. The power of a Dragonlord was passed to the eldest child, or, in this case, only. He hadn't known Huneth had been with child when he'd left. He sort of wished he had. Perhaps it might not have been the best life on the run from Uther, but they would have been a real family. When they were attacked and Merlin was disarmed, Balinor didn't think for a moment about stepping between her and the sword. She, it seemed, had more battle clarity than him and seized him, yanking them both down to the ground, crying out, as the sword meant to run them through grazed her arm, slicing through her jacket and shirt. A sword bloomed through the front of their attacker, and Arthur rushed forward, pulling Balinor off of Merlin and examining her arm. Balinor blinked. He knew that look, though he hadn't seen it in many years. The last time he saw it, Uther was looking at Igraine. "I'm all right, Arthur," Merlin insisted, even as Arthur tore his own cloak to dress her wound. Unsure what else to do, Balinor stepped off into the trees to fetch the horses. He wasn't quite sure how to feel about the fact that the Prince of Camelot was in love with the daughter he hadn't known he had. They rode hard back to Camelot, Arthur riding double with Merlin, seeming to not wish to trust Balinor with her, though he was trusting him to help them save the kingdom. When they reached the walls of Camelot, there were only 2 guards on duty who bowed them through the gates. The town was a bit in shambles. Scorch marks littered the ground, and there were burns on the white walls of the citadel. "Merlin!" a female voice called out, and Merlin wiggled in Arthur's hold until he released her, as a pretty maid with flyaway black curls and a soot-stained face ran up to them. She barely paused to curtsy to Arthur. "It's Lila!" Apparently, that was all Merlin needed, as she took off at a run, the girl following her barely a step behind. Arthur frowned, but shook his head when Balinor raised an eyebrow. "Merlin's something of a apprentice to Gaius, the court physician," he admitted. Balinor nodded slightly. "She's also my maidservant," Arthur said, a slight warning in his voice, as though he was trying to ensure Balinor stayed away from Merlin. The 2 of them made their way up to the courtyard, and were met by Uther, Gaius, and a few scattered knights. Arthur made the introductions, though they were hardly necessary. Gaius raised an eyebrow at him, as Uther nodded stiffly, hating that he needed Balinor's help. "Where's Merlin?" Gaius asked. Gwen caught us on our way in. Something about a Lila," Arthur said, handing his reins off to a groom. "Oh, this is probably the worst time for her to have the baby," Gaius said, shaking his head. "If it's not one thing, it's another," he muttered. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Can Merlin do that on her own?" he asked. Gaius nodded. "Her mother is a midwife. Merlin's been trained to deliver children. It's the reason she came to Camelot in the first place, to learn more than just that," Gaius said, and Balinor had to bite back a laugh. Gaius had aged. There were now more lines on his face, and his hair was fully white now, but his attitude had not changed. Balinor had at least one knight following him at all times, which, while it made sense, made him uncomfortable. Prince Arthur followed him as well as he followed Gaius to help with the injured. It took nearly 3 hours for Merlin to show back up. When she did, she wasn't alone. The maid who'd stopped them was with her, carrying a baby wrapped in Merlin's jacket. Merlin herself was supporting the exhausted-looking mother. One of the guards rushed forward to embrace the woman. "It's a boy," Merlin announced with a grin, and was quickly embraced by the guard as well. "Thank you so much," he said, as Merlin guided his wife to one of the few free cots. Gwen handed the guard his son. Merlin stepped over to where Gaius was standing and quickly washed her hands in the basin set aside for that. She and Gaius split up, making their way around the massive sick room with a practiced efficiency. Arthur frowned at Balinor. Why did you actually come to help us?" he asked quietly. Balinor gestured to where Merlin was redressing a wounded knight's arm. "Because of her. People like her. They do not deserve Kilgara's wrath," he said, and Arthur nodded. "She's saved my life more times than I'd like to admit at this point," Arthur admitted under his breath. "Looks like she's done it again." He shook himself. "What do you need to defeat the dragon?" "A guarantee of safe passage out of Camelot after it's done," Balinor said, and Arthur nodded. "To no longer live in fear of Uther's knights chasing after me, no matter where I go." "Reasonable. You have my word you will not be pursued if you stop the dragon," Arthur swore. "On my mother's grave, I swear it." A cry of pain sounded across the room. One of the patients was shaking, had managed to throw Merlin to the floor. Not that seemed to slow her down. Arthur darted over to the man, restraining his arms as Merlin set back to work stitching up his wound. She nodded to Arthur and winced as she flexed her hand. Arthur frowned. "You haven't gotten your arm checked out, have you?" Arthur said with a frown. "It's fine, not even bleeding anymore," Merlin tried to argue, but Arthur was already looking around for Gaius. But both he and Gwen were busy, so Balinor stepped forward and helped Merlin with her jacket. Easing back her torn sleeve, he frowned slightly at the spots of red on the green of the bandage Arthur had applied back in the woods. Arthur hovered, even as Merlin handed Balinor the supplies he needed. Merlin barely flinched as he applied one of Gaius's potions and rewrapped the injury. Arthur nodded as Merlin tugged her jacket back on. "Have one of the grooms saddle 3 horses. Don't try to do it by yourself with that arm, and know that you're only coming because I know I can't stop you," Arthur said to Merlin, and she nodded, racing over to Gaius to tell him where she was going. Uther, who was standing nearby, waved the knight he'd been speaking to over to Merlin. He was tall, with dirty blonde curls. Balinor couldn't tell if they were normally that color. Everyone here was covered in a good amount of soot. He spoke lowly to Merlin, who frowned but nodded before rushing off. Uther's glance was full of malice. Balinor knew in the end that Uther would not let him go, no matter what Arthur promised. But it eased his mind to know that even if he did die, he had, even unknowingly, left a successor. The Dragonlords would not die with him. When the time came for them to face the dragon, he and Arthur were met in the courtyard by the curly-haired knight and Merlin, both already astride their horses. Merlin's long brown skirt covered much of the horse's flank, but Arthur didn't seem to notice as he leapt onto his own horse in fresh armor. Balinor mounted up, and Uther nodded to the party as they made their way out of the city. Balinor couldn't help but notice the knight's hand on his sword the whole way. Kilgara came when he called. It made tears rise to his eyes. He had not seen him since before Merlin was born. Had not felt the presence of another of his kin for many years, let alone his dragon, for that was what Kilgara was. He could feel their connection, and the dragon's connection to Merlin as well. They were kin in soul, though not in blood. Siblings, or the best equivalent of it. "Balinor, in truth, I did not expect you to come," Kilgara rumbled in English before switching to the grumbling roar of the draconic language. "Are you here to end what Uther began so long ago?" "No, I am not here to kill you. I will not make you suffer the death of your kind before your time." Out of the corner of his eye, Balinor saw Arthur tense and the knight Leon draw his sword. But I will not let this madness continue, Kilgara. Switching to Draconic, Balinor spoke, and everyone in the clearing could feel the power behind his words, though only he, Kilgara, and Merlin could understand the meaning. You will never attack Camelot or her people again on pain of death. He repeated the command in English. Kilgara bowed his head. And if the young warlock should need my advice, as she has often sought help, you know you will not be allowed to stay with your daughter in Camelot. Even now, Uther has plans to kill you should you return. The dragon asked in Draconic. It took everything in Balinor not to turn and look at his daughter. A warlock. That was supposed to be a myth. A child born with magic. She has the words now to call you if you are needed. Answer her call. Answer her should she call, as you would answer me. He ordered, then switched back to English, mostly for the benefit of the prince and the knight. Leave now and do not return. The dragon roared as though in pain and flew off. Merlin had to press her lips together to hold off a laugh as Kilgara weaved through the air as though injured. She hopped down from her horse, and everyone raised an eyebrow at her, partly because they had not expected her to dismount, and partly because she'd been hiding a small pack under her skirt, tied to the saddle. Merlin, what are you doing? Arthur asked. Making sure you can keep your word. After all, Leon was sent to kill Balinor when his task was finished. She said, looking up at Arthur's right-hand man, who had not put away his sword, but was looking down at the ground, shame in his eyes as he nodded. Arthur put himself between Balinor and Leon. I gave my word, Leon. Safe passage for the safety of Camelot. Arthur was incensed. Leon nodded, looking uncertain. The king need never know he's alive. Give me your cloak. Merlin turned to Balinor, holding out her hand. Arthur and Leon both blinked at her, but Balinor pulled off his cloak and handed it over. Merlin pulled a knife from her boot and slid it across her palm. Arthur made to protest, but Merlin had already taken the bloody dagger and shoved it into the cloak, ripping a sizable hole into the fabric. There's another in the pack, she said, smearing her blood around the tear in the cloak, soaking the weave of the fabric. Balinor smiled. Sweet girl, you are brilliant, he exclaimed softly, and she beamed at him. Leon, your sword. Arthur demanded as he too dismounted. Balinor followed suit, as did Leon, handing over his sword. Merlin smeared her blood on that as well, just in case it was checked, and shoved the bloody cloak at Leon, who took it, stowing his sword. Balinor took Merlin's hand and whispered a few words over it, the cut sealing as his eyes flashed gold. We'll say she bolted when the dragon appeared, bucked me off. Would hardly be the first time that's happened, Merlin said. Just release her when you get where you're going. With Uther believing you're dead, you won't have to hide in some cave anymore. She commented lightly, and he smiled, squeezing her hand. He mounted up and bowed to Arthur and Merlin from his place in the saddle. Perhaps one day Camelot will truly have a king that is worthy of your service, young Merlin. For now, the prince will have to do, he said before taking off into the trees. Arthur turned to Leon. None of the truth of this is to ever reach my father or anyone else. As far as Camelot is concerned, the dragon is dead, and the last Dragonlord with him. Leon bowed, looking relieved. I did not wish to kill him after he saved Camelot. It would not have been the honorable thing to do. Thank you, sire. You really are brilliant, Merlin, Leon said, and was treated to his own grin. Arthur shook his head slightly. I may have to keep a closer eye on you, Merlin. That was almost too clever, he said as he mounted back up. Merlin laughed as she mounted Balinor's horse. Why did you do it? He asked as they began to make their way back to Camelot. Merlin shrugged. I knew you gave your word, but I did not expect your father to keep it. I knew when Leon told me he'd been ordered to come with us that he'd been ordered to kill Balinor. It was written all over your face, she said, and Leon frowned. I know what your word means to you, Arthur. If I can help you keep it, I will. Arthur couldn't help the smile on his lips as they emerged back onto the road to Camelot. It meant more to him than he could say that he had someone more loyal to him than his father.